Well, thank you very much for having me here this morning. I'm so pleased that you put together this symposium, and I'm very glad to be here. So what I'm going to talk about this morning is the development of muddy sedimentary strata on continental margins. To tie that back into the sustainability sort of notion, there are a couple of ways you can look at it. Well, I think over the last couple of decades, there's been an enormous increase in how we understand the importance of muddy sedimentary systems as part of sort of the global hydrocarbon system. Also, from my own perspective, as someone who works in the study of modern river deltas and their conservation and the changes that are occurring on those deltas, understanding how mud routes through these systems is critically important, and it'll impacts the future of probably 1 in 14 people or more living on the face of the earth right now. But so what we're going to look at, and specifically here, is something that I've been fascinated by for decades. And you could take that either as it's a very tough question because we've still got unanswered questions, or maybe I'm just not a very good scientist, or maybe it's a combination of the two. But at any rate, so we're going to look at the processes that control the development of these strata and the preservation of the fabric within these strata from thin section to outcrop scales with modern and ancient examples. So I'm not a modeler by any case, but I very much appreciate the use of models to test ideas. And I had a mentor in grad school who made the comment one time that a mathematical model is not anything more than a mathematical expression of a hypothesis or a set of coupled hypotheses. It's not necessarily the truth, but it's a tool by which we can evaluate the truth. And just as an example of this lengthy and somewhat bombastic hypothesis that I have on the left-hand side, basically what it says in sort of the Queen's English is, if you're looking at the sedimentary fabric of deposited muddy sediments, the fabric will tend to be dominated by biogenic processes. It'll be bioturbated if that sediment has been mixed more rapidly by biological processes than it has been either buried or reworked by physical processes as it transits through the active zone within the seabed. And this is actually expressed in this nifty little equation over on the right-hand side, which I'm not going to take you through, but this is two different ways of looking at a hypothesis. And focusing on, again, on muddy sedimentary strata, I want to give you what I think is one of the great examples of the use of models, both as a success and a failure, in understanding how muddy sediments are routed through coastal and marine sedimentary systems. So what you're looking at here in the central panel is the gray spot is the location of a mid-shelf mud belt off the northern coast of California that's formed by the Eel River sedimentary deposits. This was a primary focus of a project funded by the Office of Naval Research in the 1990s called the Stratiform Program. And one of the objectives was to figure out how the physics and sedimentology of the coastal ocean took water coming out of this river down here, transported the sediment up, and arrived at this location. Well, my colleague Courtney Harris, she and I were both working on her dissertations at the time, and she took what was probably one of the most advanced coupled ocean and sediment transport models in the world at that time, and she applied it to this system. And what we see here is two different time points in a simulation that she ran. The yellow and the gray shades represent the location of the ocean, of the plume coming out of the river in the coastal ocean, and the red boundary represents the location of the depot center that formed as a result of this plume using a conventional model for dispersed sediment transport, mostly from hypopycnal sort of buoyant plume and advection and diffusion. So it didn't match up at all. We were using the most advanced model, she was, and she couldn't reproduce what we saw in the real world. Well, at the same time, observational work was going on, tripods and cores and all kinds of stuff like that. And we ascertained, particularly Andrea Ogston and Peter Tchaikovsky separately identified that it was not sort of dispersed water column transport that was doing this, but it was actually gravity-driven flow in the boundary layer that was augmented by the turbulence of waves and currents that was allowing these hybrid flows to move from the inner shelf down to the middle shelf and then deposit as it began to approach the wave base. Courtney took the mathematical sort of analysis of Tchaikovsky and Ogston and inserted it into her model, and was then able to reproduce to a significant degree what we actually saw in the seabed. And this was the beginning of, I think, a real paradigm shift in how we understand how mud comes from river mouths and gets transported across continental margins. There had been ideas about this for decades, but there had been a lot of argument about it, and no one had actually been able to couple observations with a good, solid numerical model to show the results. So why mud? Well, mud, I love it. For one, that's one of the reasons I'm talking about it. Another reason is it's the largest sedimentary material that leaves the continents and moves into the oceans, the largest amount. 90% of what comes out of rivers is in suspension is mud, so it's a huge part of sort of the mass transport in the rock model, the rock cycle that occurs on the surface of the Earth. So from a mass balance perspective, it's very important. It's also important because in modern systems, because it affects how we develop harbors, how we run pipelines across the intercontinental shelf, delta conservation, and also submarine landslides off of the mouth of places where the sediments pile up very quickly, like the Mississippi Delta. There's some great examples of this. This is a paper by Rudy Slingerland and others in 2008 showing clinothems off the Gulf of Papua that are created by these types of hybrid flows. The Ganges-Brahmaputra from a great study by Steve Keel in 1997. Again, created by these, we think, by these types of hybrid flows that are a combination of gravity, waves, and currents. And other locations, including our work on the Mississippi and Chafalaya deltas, the Po, Yellow, Amazon, you could name many, many more. And what we found from looking at these modern systems is that there are several key factors that we have to know to understand how material routes through the system. First of all, the combination of waves and currents operating in the boundary layer are a critical component. Secondly, the physics of fluid muds, of high concentration suspensions in the bottom boundary layer, are also a fundamental role in how this material moves through the system. Thirdly, the timing of the sediment delivery, of tides, waves, and seasons of high and low energy are also important. For example, if a river discharges the bulk of its load during a period where the coastal ocean is quiescent, the material will pile up near the river mouth and form a proximal dominated delta. If the coastal energy level is higher, then the sediment will be dispersed over a broader area. The same physical laws apply, but the geometry of the deposits will be quite different. And what you come up with is a clinothem, typically, at some scale, where the inner portions are coarse, fairly clearly bedded because physical processes are dominant, going back to that equation that I showed you on the first slide. As we move farther offshore, the sediment's fine, but the preserved bedding remains physically stratified because, again, you get very high deposition rates and high physical reworking. And as we go into deep water, or deeper water, the accumulation rate drops off, the bioturbation rate is able to overprint the material, and so you end up getting a bioturbated, finer grained sediment on the toe of these things. This is not a new idea. I mean, this has been around since Moore and Scruton in the 1960s, but we can now simulate aspects of this numerically, and it's very satisfying. There are also some great examples of this in ancient systems. I mean, there's a lot of mud on modern margins. There was a lot of mud on ancient margins as well. Now, this is not an area where I'm an expert, but I've traveled around through the mid-continent, as many of you have, and many of you study these things. And the Cretaceous Interior Seaway is a great example of a time and place where muddy sedimentary strata played a critical role, and now they're producing abundant oil and gas from different reservoirs across North America. So the Manco Shale and correlative formations would be important examples of this. And this is a photograph of the Mancos in southwestern Colorado with the with the Mesa Verde sandstone on top of it. And this is a regional cross-section that shows, you know, these are actually widespread sedimentary strata that form an important part of sort of the mid-continent sort of sedimentary cover. And as you go from, as you travel from the top sets that are dominantly coarse grain over the rollover point into slightly deeper water, you encounter really diverse, beautiful sedimentary products, like we see here from a paper that Jürgen published a number of years ago. Again, this is a photograph from near Mesa Verde National Park. And so, how come we haven't figured all this out? How come it took us so long to get to the point where we actually have a phenomenological understanding of this? Well, muds are complicated. And you really don't have to look any farther than a classic Kuhlstrom diagram to see this. And so we can see here a boundary that defines the boundary between erosion and transport and deposition. And the red area indicates the sort of the location of where muds are, particles finer than about 63 microns. But in reality, they're not two boundaries there. There are an infinite number of trajectories because mud changes its physical and rheological properties according to its consolidation state, according to its mineralogy, according to, to the degree of bioturbation which it is experienced. So there's a lot of complicated stuff that's going on with these, and the system can be reset by physical resuspension. So you can take an ancient mud that's an old mud that's very firm and resistant to erosion. If you have enough energy, you can reset the system entirely and turn it back into a dispersed sediment. This is a very simple sort of example of this. These are two plots of a model for fine sediment deposition by Neumeier et al., 2008. Essentially, what I simulated was the deposition of a fluid mud, 30 centimeters thick, in still water. So it's like a settling column experiment. And what happens here is, as we go forward in time, this goes out to about 65 hours, the vertical plot is the density of the sediment, the density of the suspension. The bottom plot is the critical shear stress with respect to erosion for this. And what you see is the sediment-water interface drops because it's expelling water, it's becoming more consolidated. And as this happens, the critical shear stress increases as the particles come closer and closer. And this will continue out for a very long period of time, and it will be totally reset if it's resuspended. So these are very complicated materials. There's actually been a more recent model published by Han Winterwerp in 2018 that's more detailed in terms of realistic physics, but it does essentially the same thing that we see here. So, what do we know and what do we not know, sort of to get back to Rumsfeldian sort of look at things? Well, we understand how dispersed mud is carried up through the coastal ocean fairly well. And this is because it follows the water, and we understand the physics of water transport in the coastal ocean. This is a plot of, again, going back to the Eel River Shelf, of a fairly simple model that Malcolm Scully and Carl Friedrichs and Don Wright put together in 2003. It's an elegant piece of work that pretty much uses only the wave field, the gradient of the seabed, and the sediment supply from the intercontinental shelf to do a very effective job of predicting where the sediments are going to pile up. So it's a good representation of oceanic flood deposits. And the same model was adapted and applied to a more current-dominated system for the New Zealand shelf by Amy Ma and others in 2008. So this is several decades old now, but we made a lot of advances in the last couple of decades in terms of a more realistic and complicated physical representation of these dispersal processes. So this is I'm not going to explain the whole detail of these complicated figures, but these are model simulations of fluid mud dispersal off the mouth of the Atchafalaya River during sort of a typical spring discharge off the southwest coast of Louisiana. And it uses a coupled atmospheric model, sort of driven by real winds and meteorological phenomena, coupled to an ocean wave, ocean current model, and that's coupled to a newly written fluid mud component that does a really good job of simulating where the material gets routed through the systems, the vectors for transport, and ultimately where it gets deposited. So I think that's quite a successful piece of work. We'll find out what the reviewers say, in a few weeks. Now, where it begins to break down is in terms of actually predicting what sedimentary strata are formed. And that's what we're interested in here, not just the mass transport phenomena, but actually what you see in an outcrop or what you see in a drill core or a piston core when you pull it back up from the ocean floor. Now, this is an exceptionally complicated diagram that comes out of a computational fluid dynamics model by Emery Ozdemir. So this is from a 2011 paper, but he's still working on this problem. But it's fairly easy to understand. These plots are each a map of a density surface that might be a piece of seabed, simulated seabed, that could be 1 by 2 meters. So it's a small portion of the seabed, maybe the size of one of these tables. And this density surface, you can imagine that like the top of the ludocline, or the top of a suspended sediment layer, or a density horizon within the ludocline. And then the top panel is the velocity field underneath one wave, one ocean wave, as it passes by the location. Okay, so you've got the oscillatory motion, the acceleration and deceleration that occurs with the wave. And going from the left-hand to right-hand cases, we've got a sort of a low settling velocity, medium settling velocity, and a higher settling velocity here. And in each case, as we go from left to right, you can see that this is a rough surface and this is a smooth surface. And what that means in terms of the physics is that you're going on the left-hand side from a system that's dominated by turbulence to one that is laminar on the right-hand side. And we've been, Emery and I and our colleagues have been thinking about this for a number of years, and we think that the transition back and forth with every wave passage between turbulence and laminarity is a critical part of how these sedimentary strata form underneath a high concentration mud layer in the bottom boundary layer. And we tried to capture some of that in this figure, which is adapted from a couple of our papers looking at fluid mud dynamics, where the sedimentary strata are created directly by the deposition of sediments under quickly varying laminar and turbulent conditions. So we can also look at ancient deposits, and there's been a lot of really great work done there by people in this room, by Jürgen and Janek and a number of others. And so we have great examples from outcrops and thin sections that show different types of sedimentary strata that are preserved in ancient rocks. And we also have some really good hypotheses on how these might have formed. But what I would say is that these hypotheses are quite plausible, but they've never actually been demonstrated numerically. And I think it would be really exciting to be able to create these sedimentary strata from the processes that we're proposing. So this is an area that I think is ripe for extra work. Similarly, in laboratory experiments, there's been a lot of great work by these authors and others looking at how muds and heterogeneous sediments transport and are deposited under a range of flow conditions and concentration types. Again, there are limitations on this because if you go to a place like the eel shelf or the cliniform front of Ganges Brahmaputra, conditions are much more energetic. We're dealing with larger flows with higher sediment concentrations and large waves going through the system. So most laboratories that are operating can't really encompass the complete parameter space of this. So there's some limitations to that. Now there's some ways we can get around that by using like large U-tube-shaped flumes to look at higher energy wave conditions. But this is an area that's also ripe for continued research. And then once you create these deposits, are they going to be preserved? How are they going to make it through the filter of bioturbation, or how are they going to make it through reworking by subsequent sedimentological processes? And again, with respect to bioturbation, we have some models for how that might proceed. The right-hand side is a simulation using the equation I showed you in the first or second slide. So over the course of a couple of years, you're on a continental shelf, and sediment is depositing at a steady rate, and it's being mixed. Sediment that is fully stratified is red, sediment that's fully bioturbated is blue, And so sediment is buried and buried and buried, and all of a sudden, bang, there's a big flood deposit that forms. It's deposited, you have physically stratified sediment that over time is buried further and is bioturbated. So this is one way that you can approach this. And this is actually a very crude simulation that I did because I don't have the sort of modeling skills to do an elegant job of it. But this is it's unpublished from actually from an AAPG presentation a couple of years ago, where blue, this is the eel shelf going from inner shelf to outer shelf with the middle shelf mud deposit shown here with the thickest layer of sediment. 100-year-long simulation. And the take-home message is that, so the blue is bioturbated, yellow is physically stratified, and what you see is that the middle portion of the sedimentary deposit with respect to the shelf has some zones of preserved sedimentary fabric, physical sedimentary fabric, that are reminiscent of what we actually see in the study area. So one of the things I'd like to propose for the future is, suppose we could have something that was like a Bauma sequence for continental shelf sedimentary strata. Well, because Bauma sequence is focused on, just on turbidites, so it would actually have to be a much more multivariate type of phase space, kind of like the phase diagram that Boss and all proposed in 2009, but looking more at wave current gravity interactions. And we started with this in a paper published 2 years ago that essentially we use a ternary diagram to represent the balance of energy from currents, from waves, and from gravity. And we also add an additional dimension that represents the period of waves, the period at which waves propagate across the system. And we've got a couple of examples that we can populate this figure with. So A represents the eel shelf, B represents the Chafalaya shelf, the Louisiana inner shelf, and C represents the Amazon. And these are just a couple of examples where we kind of know something about the hydrodynamics of the system, and we've been able to sample the sediments. But there are many more elements in this parameter space that we need to analyze, and it would be really, really exciting if we had numerical models that could actually take us from the physics of the ocean and sediment transport to the actual sedimentary product. So we can predict the oceanic dispersal of mud pretty well. We can do that now. We can also predict more or less where it will deposit on the seabed. We've got a lot of good hydrodynamic observations from a number of different types of river delta systems. And we have a lot of really good hydrodynamic models that show us the distribution of sediment and turbulence, but they don't pre-produce stratigraphy. We also got a lot of great laboratory and ancient data, and we have a few examples, not very many, of thin section scale sedimentary strata in modern delta, clinothems, for example. But what we need are some coupled models that actually take us from ocean flows all the way down to the preserved sedimentary strata that allow us to evaluate hypotheses of bed formation. So we need to be able to go from thin section to outcrop scales, like I was mentioning. We need to couple these models. We need to add good sedimentological detail so we can actually replicate at the bed scale numerically what we think might be occurring. And then we need to have appropriate field verification for these. So there's a brave new world of muddy sedimentology for us to work on out there. And I'm looking forward to another decade or two of doing that. And I'd like to thank all of my present former students, especially Christy and Catherine, and this is one of our first fluid mud cruises in 2002. All the folks at LSU, Memorial, funding agencies who supported this over the years, and also the Billy and Ann Harrison Endowment for Sedimentary Geology at LSU. Thank you very much.
We have time for questions. We're going to spill into our break anyway, so if you have an urgent question, otherwise you can ask Sam when he leaves the podium. Up to you guys.
Yes.
Jim Ryan, Wayne State University, a great talk. I just wanted to point out that there's a natural flume that sits along the Guyana coast that turns on every year, the late winter, early spring, where you get up to 4 meters of deposition, and you have migrating mud banks that migrate 1.5 kilometers a year. You might people that are interested in coastal or shelf sedimentation of muddy sediments might want to consider that. It's not the easiest place in the world to work, but that's why nobody has for many years, but I would suggest doing that.
I totally agree. I mean, if this has been a more comprehensive review of study sites, we would have had, you know, some of the early LSU and Tulane and UT work that's been done.
And University of Miami.
And University of Miami. So yeah, absolutely right. So, but it is truly a hostile environment to do coastal geology.
Well, thank you again. We have a break now. We will resume at 10:10 sharp for 3 more keynote speakers. Thank you again.